All right. Hello, everyone. There are about, admit all. There are about 30 of us at the moment. We're just getting started. Welcome to the New York Review of Architecture and Interference Archive. Another Zoom conversation. So last month, we hosted a Zoom event during the height of the quarantine and the coronavirus pandemic in New York, along with the ballot, and we had a conversation to discuss the relationship between urban planning and pandemics. So just to welcome all of you and describe our publication a little bit, the New York Review of Architecture publishes a monthly broadsheet, and we review architecture in New York. We also now send out a monthly newsletter and are hosting events. If you'd like to share this event with someone who is not able to attend, it will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. This is another way of saying this event is being recorded. So if any of you are not comfortable with that, just telling you that now. We are a collective of working architects and designers. We attend events and exhibitions, review buildings, new ones and old ones, and write articles that are about the here and now of New York City's built environment. We also engage with current events, and just this year, we've had issues dealing with everything from Trump's executive order to make America beautiful again, to the radical shift in the way all of us are occupying and experiencing our cities during the pandemic. I'd like to thank all of our collaborators, writers, artists, graphic designers, editors, members, and subscribers. One of those collaborators is Interference Archive, who has co-sponsored this event. Unfortunately, they're not able to attend, but I should just mention that we held our last physical distribution event at Interference Archive. They have an amazing collection of radical posters, everything from the Black Panther papers to all kinds of social movements in the US, and they house originals in their archive at their storefront location in Park Slope. And so we're glad to have them co-sponsor this event, and welcome to anyone who is coming by way of Interference Archive. So the idea for this event grew out of the energy and dedication that has been shown by countless protesters and organizers in recent weeks. We are all mourning the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the countless other Black Americans that have been lynched by the police officers in the United States. With the COVID-19 pandemic ongoing, anger and frustration at this injustice has really boiled over. Within this context, we decided that we wanted to have a conversation about architecture that begins to confront, in some way, the relationship between the discipline, a very white discipline, and racism in America. We hope this will be the first of many. This is, of course, not something that we can deal with in one issue of our publication or in one event, but it's an opportunity to discuss the research that Amber, Wiley, and Joy Knoblauch have been working on, and allow this conversation about racism, which is often implicit at best or ignored at worst, to at least come to the surface. There are, of course, many angles that we could take in discussing the question of racism in architecture. Students and employees of various schools of architecture and design have organized to demand greater diversity, the decolonization of curricula, and substantive reckoning with the racist legacies of influential institutions like MIT, Yale, Harvard, UVA, etc. This is an ongoing effort. This effort includes the New York Review of Architecture, though we're not very influential, and we have also been discussing how whiteness, white privilege, and unconscious bias affect our work as a publication. Yet, as a review of architecture, we also wanted to discuss the way socialization, control, and racism are blatant and implicit in the physical design of the architecture of these institutions, places where ideology, politics, and form come together in particularly poignant ways, where form and politics really overlap. Architects don't design the police, but we do design their stations. We don't design pedagogy or politics, but we design schools that are a reflection of these ideas. We don't design funding models, usually, but we do design the schools and housing, for example, that are products of these models, which often reinforce segregation and are home to those same police. So while the topics we'll discuss aren't a direct response to the broken institution of policing in the US, that is the backdrop for tonight's talk, and there are certainly many connections. Finally, I'd like to thank Aggregate for publishing the Black Lives Matter reading and including Amber and Joy's articles. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Amber Wiley is Assistant Professor of Art History at Rutgers University. She specializes in architecture, urbanism, and African American cultural studies. Her research interests are centered on the social aspects of design and how it affects urban communities, architecture as a literal and figural structure of power. She focuses on the ways local and national bodies have made the claim for dominating narrative and collective memory of cities, and examines how preservation and public history contribute to the creation and maintenance of the identity and sense of place of a city. Her book, Concrete Solutions, Brutalism and Black Power in the Nation's Capital, is in progress. Professor Wiley studied architecture at Yale and UVA and has a PhD in American Studies from George Washington University. Joy Knoblauch is Assistant Professor of Architecture at the University of Michigan. She teaches history and theory of architecture as an exploration of architecture's engagement with politics and science. She is on the steering committee of the University of Michigan's Science, Technology, and Society program and the steering committee for the Graduate Certificate in Healthy Cities. Her first book, The Architecture of Good Behavior, Psychology and Modern Institutional Design in Postwar America, was just published in April of 2020. Professor Knoblauch studied architecture at Cornell and Yale and has a PhD in the history and theory of architecture from Princeton University. And so, without further ado, and I know that these are difficult questions, and Amber, your work deals with race in a more explicit way, I think, and while Joy, your project, and I think you've stated this, deals with history in which race was always kind of there, but not always explicitly part of the conversation. And so I guess to both of you, the first question I would ask is, with the current protests and conversations about race in the backdrop, how do you see the relationship between institutions like schools, prisons, hospitals, and public housing, and socialization and control in the US? And I know that's a broad question, but it can also be a way of introducing also your reaction to the protests and where you're calling in from. And if you want to begin, Amber, that would be great. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's great to see some of you all, or at least see some of your names and a few faces. It's really heartening because, yeah, we've been in the house. Some of us have been in the streets. And actually, that was something I was thinking about. I'm in Central Jersey. I teach at Rutgers, New Brunswick. And, you know, we've been on lockdown since early mid-March. As you know, New Jersey in the tri-state area has been hit quite drastically by the COVID crisis. So, you know, it's one of the things that I've been thinking about is how, one, thankful I am that I have a home, thankful that I am that I can work from home. I don't have to leave, right? Thinking about issues of housing, who has safe quarters, thinking about obviously our essential workers and people who have to interact on a daily basis. I've said kind of ironically to a good number of folks I've talked to is like, are they essential or are they expendable, right? Like that, you know, what are we talking about here? Or maybe even both in some cases to some people. And so the fact that we have collectively, and actually not me physically, I've been in the house, taken to the streets, people putting their bodies on the line in support of Black lives is amazing, outstanding, terrifying. And so I think about these spaces that we occupy and even, you know, what we're willing to give up in order to support other people. And we were talking, Joy just said something about being in Ann Arbor, and I actually want to segue to her because there was a really good point that she made about who gets to march on the Capitol. And so I'm gonna do a little segue because I thought that was really poignant.
Thanks, Amber. Yeah, so I'm in Ann Arbor. Similarly, staying safe at home is the language used here. Again, presuming that you have a home in which you are safe, that it's a safe place, that you have one. So there's a lot of complexity to Michigan politics that this is what I was just saying, is that escapes me as someone who's not from here. So yeah, some people are apparently allowed to bear arms inside the Capitol building, and certain other people are not. Although the complexity of all of that, I think, brings to mind what Dante was saying, though, about, what is architecture's job? And I'm really glad to have an event like this where we ask those questions, because I think architecture for a long time has needed to talk about its complicity in who gets access to what and who has a safe home and what does that mean. And I think that Keller Easterling describes the sort of enduring innocence of architecture and its ability to sort of pretend this isn't about me. And I think it's very much about architecture literally and so we could talk, I think one of the things I like to do is kind of split it, the physicalness of the architecture and what's provided to whom, what is safety and who gets it physically. And then the other would be, what is our expertise used for as far as institutional formations? And what about our institutional formations, much less, where we sort of draw the line and say, oh, that's not our job to do funding, where some of the things that I've looked at in my book, architects merrily, and people write about the architects merrily said, no, that is part of our job. We would like to do organizing and fundraising and get the funding to do the kind of institutional work that we wish to do. And that is part of our expertise. We manage teams of subcontractors. That is our expertise. And to own that and say, we do this. And so one of the things I would refer people to, if they're interested and don't know that history, one easy way in is the CCA's exhibit on the other architect. That's one way to look at sort of other architectural practices. Always the educator, sorry.
And I'm going to jump in and say the Canadian Institute for Architecture.
Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry.
That
yes,
one?
Sorry. Long days. Yes, the Canadian Center for Architecture.
Okay.
Or just send me a message if I'm long days. Thank you.
Understood.
Yeah, so go ahead, Amber, if you want to, if you have a response.
Well, Dante, you also asked us about how we got into looking at these institutions. And the funny thing is, I had no idea I'd be looking at school architecture. Yeah, that was not anything that I was particularly interested in when I was trying to come up with the dissertation topic, which turned into like a long project beyond just obviously my grad studies. But I wanted to do something sexy, I thought, something sexy and complicated. As architects, that's what we love to do. And I actually was in a graduate seminar with Suleiman Osman at GW, and it was a DC-based, Washington, DC-based graduate seminar. And the whole point was to come up with a research paper that utilized archives in DC. And it was broad, it's American studies. And I was like, okay, some people were doing jazz, some people were doing organizing around May Day, these different topics. And I thought, well, what's something in DC I don't really know that much about? And so this is how I came to Dunbar High School, which was the first high school for Blacks in the nation. But also in my research, I discovered the first high school in Washington, DC. That's the part that folks often don't say, but it was the first high school, period, in the District of Columbia, formed in 1870 as the college preparatory for colored youth. And I had heard all these things about the school. It was the best school for Blacks in the country. It had all this A list of alumni and administrators and teachers: Carter G. Woodson, Anna Julia Cooper, Blanche K. Bruce. Yeah. Mary Church Terrell and Robert Terrell taught there. Like, it was just, all these names. And despite segregation, it flourished, right? Like, this is the story. And I realized DC has always been my second home. My mother was a DC native. And I was like, I've never been to Dunbar. Maybe I'll do my research on this amazing school. And so, you know, I pulled it up on Google Maps. It was right around the corner from my grandpa's house. I had never been there. I drive up to the building and I thought I had the wrong address, because what greeted me was about a 7 or 8 story tall, brutalist, windowless behemoth. And I was like, this is not the Dunbar. I don't know what this is, but this is not what I had envisioned in my head, right? Red brick regal something. And then I got this other thing and I was like, okay. And I immediately jumped to a number of conclusions. You know, this building came from outside the community. This was a statement of demand put onto the Black community to put them in their place. Like, I had all these ideas of what it was. And as I did my research, I realized that I was wrong. Like, a lot of my assumptions were wrong. And we can get into that a little bit later, but, you know, my entree into looking at school design really was asking the question, like, what in the hell is this? This, 1970s Dunbar High School. How did this happen? And I love brutalist design as an aesthetic. And it's a complicated relationship. Because when we think about brutalism, we think of these major urban renewal projects and we know about displacement and we know about all this stuff. But, you know, the sculptural aesthetic of brutalists, I think probably I was brainwashed because I went to the Yale School of Architecture. But, you know, that's really, so I have a very complicated relationship with brutalism, but that's how I started to think about school design. I looked at design in Philadelphia, in Atlanta as well. So if anyone's familiar with Philadelphia, University City High School, which has been demolished, it was right by Penn. It was an urban renewal project. William Penn High School on Broad Street, which has also been demolished. In Atlanta, Frederick Douglass High School, these buildings that were built in Black communities in the 60s and 70s. And just really trying to understand what was happening, right? And so that's how I got into it, because I realized Dunbar was not, in the sense that it was a brutalist building in the Black community, it was not an anomaly as a high school design. And so that's how I got into that, and then just moved forward from there.
So maybe I'll ask one follow-up and then we'll move to Joy in terms of her work on institutional architecture. But from reading some of your work, Amber, it seems like schools, they offer a really compact example of this overlap between power, ideology, politics, and form. And in the US, in particular in the cities that you've studied, I wonder how the architecture of schools, one, has sort of changed or developed since integration. I mean, obviously DC and Atlanta are different than Philly. Those were, all of those cities were segregated in one way or another. But what is the relationship in your studies, between the architecture of schools, policing, and social control? And if you want to talk about Dunbar, I think that offers a poignant example.
Okay, so, generally, school buildings were built by municipal architects, city architects. So in Washington, you'll see Eastern and what is now Cardozo look exactly like, because they were built by the same architect, although William Ittner was in on that. But Snowden Ashford was a municipal architect who was in charge of at least the construction of Dunbar High School from 1916, which is the building I did not see. And Eastern and what was Central. So it was this municipal kind of, let me just plop all the schools here and I have a general template and I know what I'm doing and I'm just changing the size, double loaded corridors, planning for efficiency, planning for kind of recitation, lectures with the professor or the teacher on high, lecterns, and then you've got rows of desks that were nailed to the floor so that the children would sit and listen and don't go anywhere. To when we start moving into the post-war era, post-World War II, that's when you see people starting to specialize in building types for schools, not just all public buildings, but maybe, you know, these are the folks the firms who actually specialize in these school buildings. And so major firm competition for high school, elementary school, middle school, because we're building out in the suburbs now. But what I realized when I was doing my research is for the buildings that I looked at in DC, Atlanta, and Philly, these communities got new schools in the late 60s and early 70s, but they were deeply entrenched within these racial enclaves. So, you know, there was all this rhetoric about integration, but by the time that our communities actually got their school buildings, the possibility of residential integration was far gone, because, you know, FHA people were moving out to the suburbs. And I think of some of these school buildings that I looked at as consolation prizes. Like, oh, we erected this school building in 1972, 1975, 1977. And they're consolation prizes because the idea of integration didn't actually happen. What a lot of the folks in DC were rallying for were better school facilities. They were overcrowded. I just got through earlier this week looking at a report that was published in 1948 that talked about, you know, 70% of classrooms in DC public schools for the segregated Black community had 30 or more students, and 25% of the junior high classrooms in segregated Black communities had 40 or more students. 40 students in the classroom in a junior high, you know, and they were getting these second rate, you know, hand-me-down schools. Schools were transferred from the white division, which was Division I, to Division II, the Black division, as the white folks moved out of the neighborhood. And so they were overcrowded, they were old, and this is in the 40s and 50s. And so the push for integration was like, we want better resources, better buildings, better facilities. And, you know, integration didn't ever really happen in DC. They said it did. They were like, oh, it's a model. We integrated so quickly. I'm like, no, we didn't. DC was majority Black by 1957, you know? And I don't remember the other part of the question, but so that's kind of how it, at least the evolution happened in DC. And DC was different from any other city I looked at because of Howard University and their School of Architecture. And they had trained Black architects who were working and producing in the city and who got major commissions after the 1968 uprising. And that's even how Dunbar got built, because Dunbar was built in 1977, the newer one, the brutalist one, by a Black firm who got the commission. They didn't have the commission before the uprising. Charles Cassell, an architect, was voted onto the school board. Charles Cassell is a major figure. Write that down, Charles Cassell. Wow, he's still with us. Yeah, he put himself on the Board of Education, so that he could make sure that Black architects were getting these commissions. So that's kind of how that evolution happened. But the issue of police in schools, Cassell talked about that in the early 70s. He was like, how many police there were, armed policemen in the DC public school system in the 70s, right? And he's on record as saying, I don't want these policemen in the schools. What are they gonna do? How are they going to intervene when something happens? What is their role versus what is an administrator's role? And so again, we're having these conversations about what are police doing in schools, and we had this conversation like 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's already making me think of some interesting parallels with, you know, with Joy's work in terms of architects being able to kind of throw themselves into a political opportunity, you know, where there's this political opportunity post 68 to build these institutions, and the kind of tension between, are they political actors that create a form that is representative of a particular ideology, or it's sometimes a little bit more of a sloppy, relationship there. I wonder, Joy, if you could maybe give a short segue or intro into how you became involved in, the study of the architecture of institutions. And then it would be interesting to maybe talk a little bit about your work on housing and the defensible space theory, because I think that's very much related to policing and surveillance with clear formal, echoes as well.
Yeah. So I think one of the short origin stories could come through reading Mary McLeod's Architecture and Politics in the Reagan Era and just being deeply unsatisfied. So thinking that there must have been other ways, there must be other ways that architecture engages with the political machinery, mostly, being an American in the United States. And so digging into that, and it of course starts a lot earlier. The first case in the book is in the post-war, when the United States decides it wants to build hospitals to some extent instead of giving nationalized health insurance. And at that point, the architects really are asked to get involved and to act. It's not necessarily architectural opportunism. They were asked to be an intermediary with their communities and to bring their skills toward modern building. And so I got interested then, kind of tracing things through sort of nerdy history of bureaucracy kind of things that I found interesting. And so one of the sort of side notes that I've never published, but belongs here as well, is I did a little bit of work on the Douglas Commission, the National Commission on Housing, I believe. There are a couple different ones that dealt explicitly with architecture. But again, the architects on the commission had a really unsatisfying contribution to my mind. And largely contribute this really strange, like 2 or 3 pages in the report to do with literally style and strunk and white and these things. And so I encourage anybody to look into that. But these kinds of, I was interested in these moments of, when do architects have influence? Is it through form or is it through our skills? Why does change happen? Why does it not happen? And so the 1963 community mental health centers is another really interesting one where architects were called upon, like, hey, use your avant-garde skills and give us a form, for, a complicated ideology. And that while the community mental health centers proliferate and exist and are ubiquitous, the avant-garde forms have not stayed. And I'm a historian, which will tell you that I have many minds about whether form should be used for these things or should not be. And have ambivalent feelings about brutalism as well, loving and hating it. So I'm happy to have that conversation as well. What is form a good tool for, and when is it not time to use our? I always tell my students, the answer to every problem is not to build something new, not to design something new. Many of our, important impacts for change can come through being humans and using our human skills, and then to just bring in the question of defensible space. I mean, that came out really quickly as I started to think about the way that expertise was working, because that too is really complicated and not always a positive thing. And in his case, having approached, he kind of started very naively, coming out of writing up the Otterlo conference, wanting to do good and build community. And the places he found funding at that time were largely toward policing and toward crime prevention. And so he took off in that direction. And, it's again, another complicated figure with a complicated history, but, to some extent it was his, grantsmanship that landed him there rather than in some other worlds.
Maybe Joy, I'll just give a quick, because I just for some of our audience who may not be familiar with Oscar Newman or even the reference, but and maybe you can respond, because I feel like there's kind of this narrative, which I could vastly oversimplify here, but there's like a narrative that modernist architects, they designed these big towers in the park at a time when there was this political effort towards integration, and maybe some of them even imagined that some of these places could be integrated. And they put them in the cities, in the existing urban cores. This effort was undermined by some sort of parallel forces within the American government and banking industry that conspired to divide people, and basically sowed the seeds of white flight. So then when the opportunity arose to build low-rise housing that sort of proclaimed a clean break with the architectural ethos of these towers in the park and everything that they represented, basically architects jumped on the bandwagon. And so someone like Oscar Newman, it sounds like, is really, in a way, kind of like, you could say, the figurehead of that. And it was funny, just as an anecdote, when I was initially corresponding with Joy, if anyone has seen the HBO series Show Me a Hero, which takes place in Yonkers, New York, you know, and it's about housing integration, literally the kind of tireless architect who's really like, you know, putting it in for the good fight is Oscar Newman, who has this idea of like, oh, you know, it's the problem is these horrible towers and we just need to create something that has clear sight lines, and we can use psychology, environmental psychology to basically design something that will fix these social problems. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about sort of how architects embraced psychology. And obviously this is with a very clear racial undertone in terms of where it was carried out. And what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so one of the first things to be said is, again, you know, some things are architectural problems and some things are not. And, you know, Oscar Newman capitalized on the very public, very much publicized, you know, the photographs in Life magazine demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe housing to suggest that, you know, modernism failed, so you should buy my book because I can fix it. And literally had, you know, spreads that said alternatives to fear and things like that. So it's not a speculation. But that has been critiqued by historians. I think Catherine Bristol wrote a piece, and Nicholas Dagan Bloom's Public Housing That Worked, talking about how, you know, important factors like elevator maintenance really made the difference between which public housing worked, and that a place like St. Louis was not, you know, populated with elevator buildings and did not appreciate the extent to which that infrastructure of that high rise would need to be maintained. So just to say that it's a lot more complicated than saying, you know, the form of a building. And I think it's also a lot more, you know, I have many views about psychology, and we could talk about that some more, but it's also worth saying that you know, Oscar Newman was not a psychologist. He was not trained as a psychologist. A lot of his theories sort of relied on people like Robert Ardrey's work, who was also not an anthropologist. He was a playwright, and these kinds of questions. So, you know, when some architects, but when not Oscar Newman got picked up as potentially the savior of modern design, just shorter, it was not the case that psychology supported him. So just, you know, I think the historian is always like, oh, well, it's complicated. But, you know, before we too quickly suggest that he was a psychologist, his collaborator, you know, ultimately departed displeased with his methods. So, you know, his co-authorship didn't end up on Defensible Space. But that has not stopped the idea of defensible space and crime prevention through environmental design from becoming very popular, very lucrative. You can get a certificate in it internationally. I don't know if anyone in the audience has one or knows about it, but, you know, it's not a small thing. So from this, you know, sort of adaptation and borrowing of what Elizabeth Wood and Jane Jacobs had kind of already said, you know, he was a writer. Oscar Newman, I think, largely was a writer and did a beautiful job of rhetoric. And that's what caught the attention of architects. He sort of spoke their language with their diagrams. And I often, you know, think about influence and power happening that way. So I don't know if I got lost, but.
That's okay. We can circle back.
Okay.
We have a question from the audience, which I think either of you could take, and then I have many more questions, and we'll keep going. So Kat asks, how do we access these questions of architecture, social justice in our learning / make it more accessible outside of an academic environment? I only have a B.Arch, but in my education, I also pursued a degree in international relations, since I did think there was a necessary bridge between socioeconomics and how we design environments that people inhabit. but I don't think it was something I felt supported in researching further in lieu of more traditional architectural theory. I mean, it's a tough, maybe a tough question, but how do you access these questions of architecture and social justice outside of an academic environment?
So I was thinking about this. Dante, you mentioned earlier that a lot of alumni and students from, you know, Yale, MIT, UVA, so on and so forth, are putting their colleges to the task and making these big asks. I sat in on 2 of those calls. It's been quite a past 2 weeks, where students were highly dissatisfied with the lack of, I hate to use the word diversity, but diversity in their education, questions about, you know, the human condition in the built environment, making sure the canon is dismantled, is decolonized. Like there's so much, and that's in academia. Like they don't even do the work necessarily in the school setting. So that is, it's a hard question to answer. And I was thinking about this a couple weeks ago, having a similar conversation. I have a BA in architecture, which is a liberal arts degree, and I have a master's in architectural history, but I went and got a PhD in American studies because I didn't really understand how to talk about people. I did not. And even though I had some amazing professors, when I wanted to talk about how people use the spaces that I was researching, they were like, that's a sociology paper. And I was like, okay. You know, like I'm in the architecture school and they're telling me I can't talk about people. And that is a major, I don't know, a major downfall, crisis area, quite frankly, in the educational sphere and also in the professional sphere. Architects are beholden to their clients, and then you have to ask the question, who's the client? Is it the person who's paying to get the building erected, or is it the person who's going to use it? And so that's a thing that we have to think about. Who are you designing for? But it's so many different levels, from NCARB to NAB to these institutions. I mean, the National Architectural Accrediting Board, so on and so forth, like they have the language there that architects are supposed to be ethical. And then we still just talk about materials and building structures, which are very important, but we don't know how to talk about people. There are a lot of bibliographies that are being compiled right now, race and space bibliography. I mean, there are tons of people working to put together long lists to say that, you know, there are resources to talk about these things, but it is still highly academic. So, I mean, that's the world I reside in. I don't know if Joy or either of you all have more, you know, in the world access to those kinds of conversations.
Well, going off of that, and then I'll pass it over to Joy. We have another question that's kind of related, and I just want to encourage everyone to type questions into the chat. We only have 20 more minutes, and I know the first 40 minutes really flew by. And so if you have questions, please type them into the chat. But I have a question from Andrew, and he says, why do you think architects are afraid of people? And the people who aren't the clients, but walk the sidewalk 50 years from now? Maybe an impossible question.
I have a, go ahead, Joy.
Well, I was just gonna say, I similarly and was persistently told that my project was not architecture, and that, you know, this study of institutions, that it was not legitimate and I should go to the sociology department. And I guess I'm just stubborn and don't listen. So I just kept going. But what I did end up doing that was really productive, and I encourage, is talking to the science, technology, and society people for whom when you say, I have, as a critic, I have this antagonistic relationship to practitioners, they go, of course. You know, we're criticizing scientists. I'm not a physicist. It's a constant a normal dialogic, it's not threatening, it's you're different people with different, priorities and methods and things like that. And that really normalized that, interest in, and criticism of concepts like users, right? So I got a lot of that, from that kind of community and method who are far more ready to be critical. And I think, I would also like to call onto the carpet a lot of the accreditation of education, and what's available to us to teach is really held, I don't have tenure yet, so I feel bad saying it, but, a lot of what we're able to teach is tightly controlled in comparison to other fields. An architecture education is set in some ways, not by the educators, but by the profession. And not that, practice is very important. And, I will also speak to the importance and value of my education at Cornell and how it makes me uniquely who I am. But I also think that if we're going to open up this conversation about decolonizing, we're going to have to talk about where architecture education does come from. But so why do architects find people threatening? I think the other thing I want to add is, when I started this project, it was, oh, you can't talk about that stuff. It really went badly for most of these actors, I think, is the other thing. And so the generation ahead of me really found most of these subjects, if it wasn't for Robert Gutman, who just also similarly, just didn't care and just said whatever he wanted, it really went badly for a lot of people, and they just did not want to talk about it. A lot of, for complicated reasons, but a lot of people just then were like, yeah, so that was a failed project. We're going to, retreat into deconstruction and theory. And so then I, ran into those theories of power that were just deeply detached from reality.
Could you talk maybe just a 1 minute more about that when you say it really went badly, just to elaborate on that slightly? Because I think the way that it really went badly is also, it's very much related to and at the core of that, where you pick up your research.
Yeah, so I have, the book talks a lot about this, and the book was kind of my attempt to figure out what happened, because it's hard to kind of figure out exactly what happened, and, talking to people who don't want to talk about it, and it didn't go well for sociology and anthropology and such either. Irving Goffman kind of famously said, we failed to predict all these huge social changes. We failed to respond. We wanted to be so radical, and we ended up clearly on the wrong side. Stories like Sim Vanderin really wishing to do well and being so horrified about the tear gassing of people at People's Park that he just decided to go do something else entirely and stopped working on institutions, and started to work on, sustainability and things like that, which are very important, but sort of gave up the social struggle at that point. And he has some nice, quotes about how things shifted. So I don't know that I have it, if anyone lived through it and wants to speak to us, I'm sure they can do that. It's not something I've gotten a really great answer on, but that seems to be the thing, is that's the moment when, having a sociologist, and even in some cases like Princeton, an urban planning department around, became problematic, and they got booted. And so I'm happy to be at the University of Michigan, where we have a planning department again. They can, such as, with their own problems, but, they can talk about people. So that's nice to have them around.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I'll just say that, like, I was on a call recently this week with two people who were founding members of the Black Workshop at Yale. And these were, basically people involved in community design centers. And it's like, yeah, Yale used to have urban planning, but it was booted after '68. And so, like, why do architects hate people? It's like, well, because we've gotten rid of all of the other adjacent disciplines that, actually talk about them.
Yeah, and the education, this is something that certainly, Jonathan Massey at Michigan, and we're definitely working on this, the studio education, just making it so hard for, those of us who go through a BArch to fraternize outside of our cohort even. So you go through that experience of your 20s, happily, intensely enmeshed in a very small silo. Mm-hmm. So how to change that, things of that nature.
I will say that came up on the UVA call about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, when they were drafting up a letter to Dean Berman, where students were like, maybe we can bring some sustained dialogue that they do in the college to the architecture school. And I'm like, y'all really, and I don't know if I forgot how disconnected the architecture school, the A school, was from the rest of UVA. But I was like, y'all don't, they're like, maybe we should bring in all these resources that the college has to the A school. And I'm like, y'all don't, they don't have this relationship? Like it's 2020, and we know Charlottesville happened in 2017. They don't. They don't. The question about why are architects afraid of people, I had a little time to think about this. It's because, yeah, they're the people who get to use the buildings and say, you know what, this was a shitty design. And we studied failed plans, failed buildings in my education, and we were like, wow, that's amazing. Le Corbusier, woo, amazing. But if the people were given the power to actually talk about what they thought about the building, Penn, Lucan, medical building, they'd be like, this is a shitty design. Like, I can't use it. And that would completely deconstruct the myth of the heroic modern architect that we love. We love that story. And we've got a number of people who went to South High School in Minneapolis. Yeah, the brutalist buildings. But so I think that that's part of the reason we've built up this myth of the white male solo practicing architect. Like, who is that?
Definitely. Apropos that, we have a question from Brent. What's up, Brent? He asks, prompted by the comments offered here, I've been noticing a deepening divide between those who believe design can solve societal problems and those that believe design is responsible for societal problems, without much productive dialogue between them. I'm wondering how we might reconcile those positions, or if they ought to be kept in tension.
I'm happy to talk about it, and it can be a brief answer. I don't like false dichotomies in general, and I like dialogue in general. So for me, and as I say, for the book project, was really to try to put those things next to each other, to see the moments where Oscar Newman is doing his sort of quasi-psychological stuff, talking to Peter Eisenman. That to understand that, through this period of the 60s and 70s, they weren't as split as they are now. So it sort of became more split. And to kind of really try to put those figures back in conversation. The famous conversation between Christopher Alexander and Peter Eisenman, I think, is really important. And I often read that with students, but I don't think they should, I don't think that those are incommensurable attitudes to have in the same head. I think that design can do good. I also think it's done a lot of bad. So the question is how, and we won't get to how if we don't talk about it. So.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Joy there. I think design can have an ameliorative effect. You've been in those spaces, you know what they feel like, but it can be oppressive as well. Just thinking about, because people are talking about this South High School in Minneapolis, which I haven't been to, but thinking about Dunbar, they wanted both. They didn't want it to be oppressive, but they wanted it to be open. It was an open plan design. Again, I told you these are Black architects. They wanted it to be a monument. What is brutalism if not monumental, right? So they weren't designing necessarily to oppress. They were designing in the language of the time. Quite frankly, budget cuts rendered some of their earlier designs useless. So places where there would have been windows, there were not. And this is technically on an economic level, even though it was the most expensive school building in the DC metropolitan area up to that point, right? They spent the most money on it. But there was this idea of passive surveillance. Someone had mentioned sightlines earlier. So that students are being watched and controlled. Think of the Panopticon, think of Michel Foucault, but they didn't feel it as much. I don't know if we can say that passive surveillance is better than the alternative, but it was in there. But there was hope that the open plan would, one, allow creative juices to flow in terms of pedagogy and student learning, but also allow for a less physical, tangible presence of like armed policemen in the school building. So there was major tension there. But one thing that I also want to point out is that though that there were Black architects who did this design, they were still trained in the aesthetic and the rhetoric of the time period. So that's what they built in. And it still goes back to what they were taught and what they were teaching. Because I was, when I was looking at this school, I was, they were looking at Paul Rudolph. Paul Rudolph is like the dude. They loved it, right? So the search for new Black forms hadn't happened in the 60s and 70s because the architects who were given the chance to do the designs were trained in the 50s and the 60s. And so they kept that design and programming mentality, even though the rhetoric had changed and they were building for their community. So that, again, it's back to what they were trained in. And Audre Lorde, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tool, has been overused, but it's true. And that's what they were attempting to do, but they only had the tools that they knew how to deal with. And so that's part of the problem. And I think it goes back to what, Joy and Dante, y'all were talking about, what is the architectural education?
Right. Yeah, so we have another question here from Chris. He asks, he says, "Hey y'all, thanks for doing this. It's awesome. Professor Knoblauch mentioned Elizabeth Wood. Can y'all talk about her work at the CHA and what happened to her and Robert R. Taylor? Dante talked about the narrative. We were told about the quote tower in the park, but that wasn't what Wood and Taylor were trying to do. And we aren't taught much about what they did do."
I don't know the story all that well, so I'm happy to let someone else tell it, but I mostly came to it from hearing Oscar Newman sort of claim Eyes on the Street and Eyes on the Hall and thing as his, when it clearly had already been in her work, as well as Jane Jacobs. So that's mostly the context in which I was, focusing on, hey, she already said a lot of this like 10 years earlier, but you claim to just have discovered it, so.
I wonder, okay, so one thing that I was hoping someone would ask, but maybe they're not going to ask, which is actually, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more, Joy, actually about the defensible space theory and Jane Jacobs, and how that may or may not also be related to race and where it was applied and how it was used. And I think this is also just related to your broader inquiry into like psychological functionalism, but maybe you could talk just a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's so much to say.
Yeah.
I think one of the first things to say about defensible space is the extent to which it reinforced a lot of middle class ideas about space, and how if a person had a space of their own, they would defend it, and how this was seen as a natural behavior is how it was constructed, in order that it didn't seem like policing, because coming at a time immediately after all of the riots against racial injustice that happened then, sort of applying lots of policing was seen as unpalatable. And so, again, borrowing all the Michel Foucault, but finding ways that would be palatable of having residents police themselves, and thinking about ways to not have officers of the New York City Housing Authority Police needing to come into high rises as much. And so, while Jane Jacobs had said Eyes on the Street, Oscar Newman was really invoking a much darker era of urban alienation. And so I think, and that resonates a lot now, and maybe I'm too focused on this history, but when the idea is defund the police, replace it with mental health workers, I find that frightening. Turn people to public shaming and policing each other and all of that kind of stuff. I don't know that, I guess this is the same thing Amber just said, is passive surveillance better than overt, concrete, hard surveillance? Is soft power better than hard power? But I think, the recapitulation, just doing the same thing again, right? And saying again, like, oh, well, we'll just police ourselves. Masking a whole lot of, the social apparatus and the, reinforcing of certain attitudes toward appropriate behavior and appropriate family life and definitions of what it means to be mentally well and who is sick. That's a very old story, and I'm a little frightened by, turning to that mode of policing. And so, and honestly, a lot of this is upsetting enough in so many dimensions that sometimes it's hard to keep a thought in my head. So if I've wandered off again, it's hard to, kind of keep it together. And, we have all these other norms about, I'm supposed to sit here calm, collected, cool, and discuss this dispassionately. And that can be exhausting and challenging. So if I've gotten distracted.
No, I think that's actually a really good point that I hadn't thought about. Sort of like, what is the relationship between passive surveillance and calls to defund or abolish the police? And I think it sort of speaks to this broader question of like, can you put the cart before the horse? Can you sort of, if you still have all of this entrenched inequality and entrenched racism and resentment and tension in the society, what does it mean to kind of turn to a passive surveillance as opposed to abolishing a more hard system? I mean, those are obviously really tough questions. Just to say, we have 3 more minutes, so if there's anyone else that wants to ask a question, otherwise I'll ask if our, let's see, I'll ask if our speakers have any closing comments, and we'll just wrap up. I want to thank everyone for coming to join. We had nearly 100 participants, which is amazing, and I want to thank also both of our speakers, Amber and Joy. Do either of you have any closing remarks about this topic?
I think my only closing remark would just be that some things are not that complicated. I think that treating people like people, I think we can take some simple statements and work from there. And we have so much room to grow as a profession and as a discipline. So I think we can do so much better.
I would say take advantage of the moment. There was my email is a dumpster fire right now, basically for the last 2 weeks. There's so much going on. There is momentum. We have to continue to push and make asks, and not even asks, demands. So many calls to actions have been put towards architectural schools, to the profession itself, to the accrediting organizations. Like, we need to keep pushing. And one thing that Joy had said, we were tweeting each other, glad our work is relevant, sad our work is relevant, right? There are cycles of this. The things that I'm reading about the 60s and 70s resonate here. And sometimes it can be very disheartening because you're like, ooh, people already had this conversation. Why are we having it right now? And there were little moments of like greatness that happened out of all the turmoil and loss in the 60s, but it wasn't sustainable. Or actually it was sustainable, it wasn't sustained. I heard Sharon Sutton speak about 2 years ago about this, because she did research when the ivory tower was Black. Okay, if you don't have that book, you should get that book, Sharon Sutton. And she talked about when Columbia recruited all these Black students to the architecture school, and she, you know, she tracked what they did in their careers, but the funding ran out, right? It was the Ford Foundation. So we also need to tap in the Fords, the Mellons, the whoever else. She was like, we need to have a sustained infrastructure to support these things. So when we're making these demands, we need to make sure that 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, that there's a framework to sustain it. Because yeah, things might happen and it might last for 5 years and then we're back in the same place where we were before. So if we learn nothing from the past, is to make sure that we're holding these organizations accountable for the long run.
Thank you, Amber, and thank you, Joy, and thank you everyone for joining. Some people have also been sharing resources in the chat for various efforts organizing to make those demands to architecture schools. So I'm going to find a way to compile that, and I can send that out to people that RSVP'd, or in our next newsletter, which we send out every Sunday. And again, thank you everyone for joining. This was really great, and we'll see you next time.